In the spring of 1905, the fragile balance of European diplomacy was abruptly tested in a city that had little apparent significance in global politics, but would come to symbolize the sharpening antagonisms of the age, Tangier. On March 31st, Kaiser Wilhelm II arrived in the Moroccan port, making a deliberately theatrical display of support for the Sultan's independence. His words, prepared carefully by Berlin's foreign ministry under Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow, went far beyond the conventional courtesies of a state visit. Standing before assembled Moroccan dignitaries and foreign journalists, the Kaiser declared his recognition of Sultan Abdelaziz as the sovereign ruler of an independent and free Morocco, promising German support against external interference. It was, in effect, a direct challenge to France's growing influence in North Africa. The timing of Wilhelm's intervention was not accidental. France, under the leadership of Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse, had been quietly consolidating its position in Morocco, encouraged by the 1904 Entente Cordiale with Britain. This agreement had recognized French primacy in Morocco in exchange for British freedom of action in Egypt, while Spain was allotted a smaller zone of influence along the Moroccan coast. For Paris, the arrangement represented an extension of its North African empire, already encompassing Algeria and Tunisia. For London, it was a practical settlement of colonial disputes that opened the way for broader cooperation with France against German power. To Berlin, however, the accord looked like the latest piece in a diplomatic puzzle that left Germany isolated, encircled by rivals, and excluded from the spoils of imperial expansion. The German leadership's decision to stage the Tangier visit reflected deep anxieties. Wilhelm himself, prone to impulsive gestures but also acutely sensitive to the prestige of his empire, believed that Germany could not afford to stand aside as France extended its influence unchecked. Chancellor von Bülow and the Foreign Office shared this assessment, though in more calculated terms. A bold demonstration in Morocco could disrupt the Anglo-French understanding, expose the fragility of the Entente, and restore Berlin's diplomatic leverage. If France could be humiliated or forced to retreat, the prestige of German power would be affirmed. The choice of Tangier as the stage was significant. The city, a gateway to the Mediterranean, had long attracted the attention of European powers for its strategic location near the Strait of Gibraltar. While Morocco itself was politically fragmented and militarily weak, the symbolism of independence carried weight in an age of imperial competition. By publicly embracing the Sultan's sovereignty, Wilhelm was effectively declaring that Germany would act as Morocco's protector against French encroachment. The gesture was calculated to resonate not only in Paris and London, but across the chancelleries of Europe, where questions of balance and precedent were keenly observed. The immediate reaction was one of shock and unease. In Paris, Delcasse regarded the Kaiser's speech as an intolerable affront, a direct assault on French policy that could not be ignored without loss of honor. The French press echoed his indignation, warning that Germany sought to strip France of its rightful position in Morocco. In London, the visit was read as a deliberate attempt to undermine the Entente, which had been so carefully cultivated by King Edward VII and Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne. While British officials were cautious in their public statements, private correspondence reveals deep suspicion of German motives. The Foreign Office noted the carefully orchestrated nature of Wilhelm's appearance, recognizing it as a calculated provocation rather than a spontaneous flourish. Across Europe, observers grasped the wider implications. Austria-Hungary, bound to Germany by alliance but wary of confrontation, followed developments closely. Italy, the other nominal member of the Triple Alliance, hesitated, its ambitions in North Africa clashing with French designs, but its broader interests pulling it toward accommodation with Paris. Russia, still reeling from the disastrous war with Japan, was in no position to intervene decisively. Smaller states, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian kingdoms, watched with apprehension, aware that a localized quarrel over Morocco could easily draw the great powers into a larger conflagration. What gave the Tangier visit its explosive quality was not merely the content of Wilhelm's declaration, but the manner in which it struck at the heart of European diplomacy. The Entente Cordiale was less than a year old, and its durability was still uncertain. German policymakers believed that Britain's commitments to France were superficial, unlikely to extend beyond the Mediterranean colonial sphere. By raising the Moroccan question to the level of international confrontation, Berlin sought to test whether London would truly support Paris in a crisis. If the Entente could be exposed as fragile or illusory, Germany would have achieved a major diplomatic victory without firing a shot. Yet the gamble was risky. France's pride was at stake, and Delcasse was not inclined to retreat. The French government began mobilizing diplomatic pressure, insisting that its role in Morocco was a matter of established international agreement, not open to challenge. At the same time, Berlin's move introduced uncertainty into the wider European system. The Kaiser's unpredictable behavior, combined with the aggressive posture of his Foreign Office, reinforced the perception of Germany as a destabilizing force, willing to provoke crises to assert its claims. Thus, the visit to Tangier became the spark of a wider confrontation. What began as a symbolic gesture in a North African port city quickly escalated into a test of wills between the great powers of Europe. Behind the Kaiser's words lay the calculations of chancelleries, the anxieties of alliances, and the unresolved tensions of an international system that had become increasingly brittle. The Moroccan question, which might once have been treated as a colonial detail, was transformed into a measure of Europe's balance of power. By April 1905, it was clear that the crisis would not fade quietly. Diplomatic correspondence multiplied, and newspapers across Europe carried headlines speculating about war. France and Germany exchanged veiled threats, while Britain weighed its obligations under the new understanding with Paris. The scene had been set for months of maneuver, intimidation, and negotiation, a drama that would unfold in chancelleries and conference halls, but whose origins could be traced back to one afternoon in Tangier, when Wilhelm II proclaimed his support for Morocco's independence. If the Kaiser's declaration at Tangier drew the attention of Europe's chancelleries, it was because Morocco itself occupied an unusually sensitive place in the strategic imagination of the early 20th century. To contemporaries, the Sultanate represented not merely another colonial opportunity, but a key node in the struggle for influence across the Mediterranean and North Africa. The weakness of the Moroccan state, combined with its location at the entrance to the Atlantic and its proximity to Gibraltar, meant that control, or even predominant influence, over Morocco carried implications far beyond its borders. The political condition of Morocco in 1905 was precarious. Sultan Abdelaziz, who had come to the throne as a minor in 1894 and formally assumed power in 1900, faced constant challenges to his authority. Tribal revolts flared in the interior, while regional notables resisted attempts at centralization. The Moqsin, the royal court and administrative apparatus in Fez, commanded loyalty unevenly, relying on fragile networks of patronage rather than a robust system of taxation or bureaucracy. European diplomats described the Sultan's authority as more theoretical than real once one moved beyond the walls of the main cities. Corruption, the absence of a modern army, and the inability to suppress piracy or brigandage further weakened the state. For France, these weaknesses represented both a danger and an opportunity. Algeria, annexed outright in 1830 and gradually integrated into the French colonial system, bordered Morocco to the east. Tunisia, acquired in 1881 under a protectorate arrangement, extended French influence along the North African littoral. Morocco was thus the last unclaimed segment of the Maghreb, and in Paris many saw its absorption into the French sphere as both logical and necessary. The argument was strategic. Unrest in Morocco could spill across the Algerian frontier, undermining French control. It was also imperial. The Third Republic, still smarting from the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871, found in overseas expansion a means of compensating national pride. British interests, by contrast, lay primarily in the security of the Mediterranean. The possession of Gibraltar had long given London command of the western entrance, but the growth of rival fleets made it imperative that no hostile power establish itself on the opposite shore. A French Morocco, while not ideal from a naval standpoint, was considered preferable to a Germany or Italy gaining a foothold. The 1904 Entente Cordiale settled the matter by acknowledging French primacy in Morocco in exchange for British freedom of action in Egypt. To British strategists, the deal was a reasonable trade. It secured the Suez Canal route while removing a source of constant colonial friction with France. Germany, however, saw the Entente as a provocation. Excluded from the arrangement, Berlin viewed it as yet another instance of rivals carving out spheres of influence without consulting the Reich. The rhetoric of German officials emphasized principles of international equality, insisting that no single power had the right to monopolize Moroccan reforms or trade. Yet beneath the language of fairness lay deeper insecurities. The Reich had arrived late to the imperial race and, apart from holdings in Africa and the Pacific, lacked possessions of comparable scale to those of Britain or France. For Wilhelm II, whose Weltpolitik was meant to project Germany as a global power, exclusion from Morocco symbolized the larger problem of being treated as a secondary player in world affairs. The Moroccan question therefore became a screen upon which the great powers projected their anxieties. For France, it was about security on the Algerian frontier and the fulfillment of its imperial destiny. For Britain, it was about preventing a hostile fleet from gaining a strategic vantage point. For Germany, it was about resisting encirclement and affirming equality in international politics. Even for Spain, whose historic ties to the northern Moroccan coast gave it a minor claim, the issue touched on prestige and the preservation of influence in the Western Mediterranean. Within Morocco itself, the situation grew ever more entangled. Sultan Abdelaziz attempted modernization in limited ways, purchasing European rifles and bicycles, introducing some reforms in the court, and surrounding himself with advisors familiar with Western methods. Yet these gestures deepened divisions at home, where conservative elements regarded the Sultan as too susceptible to foreign influence. The paradox was evident. Moroccan independence could not be preserved without foreign support, yet every concession to outside powers eroded that very independence. Wilhelm's promise of protection in 1905, therefore, was welcomed in Fez not merely as flattery, but as a potential counterweight to French pressure. The international community had already been grappling with Moroccan instability in preceding years. Agreements reached in Madrid in 1880 had affirmed the principle of equal commercial access for all powers, but enforcement was weak. European merchants complained of arbitrary tariffs, while diplomats lamented the absence of legal protections for foreigners. The French, in particular, pressed for reforms in policing and finance that would extend their informal control. German businessmen, though a minority in Moroccan trade, demanded parity, and their grievances provided Berlin with an additional pretext for intervention. Thus, by the time Wilhelm set foot in Tangier, the Moroccan question was no longer a narrow colonial matter, but a barometer of Europe's diplomatic climate. The Entente Cordiale, still fragile and untested, depended in part on whether Britain would support French claims in Morocco. Germany, in seeking to exploit Moroccan independence, was deliberately probing the new alignment. Each note of protest, each editorial in the European press, each maneuver by foreign ministries became part of a larger drama. Whether Europe's balance of power could accommodate the ambitions of all its great states, or whether the system would be driven toward confrontation. The crisis therefore took shape not because Morocco itself was of decisive importance, but because the fate of the Sultanate became entwined with broader currents of alliance and rivalry. The French looked to consolidate their empire, the British to secure their sea routes, and the Germans to assert their rightful place among world powers. The Sultan, meanwhile, clung to promises of support that he could neither fully believe nor entirely dismiss. In this combustible mixture, Wilhelm's gesture at Tangier acted less as a spark in isolation than as the ignition of a field already dry with tension. By late spring 1905, diplomats across Europe recognized that the Moroccan question could not be left unresolved. The status of the Sultanate was no longer merely a colonial issue, but a test of strength between rival alliances. How far Germany would press its challenge, and how firmly France and Britain would resist, became the central questions that would dominate the year's diplomacy and carry Europe to the edge of a general conflict. The Moroccan crisis did not unfold in isolation. Its resonance across Europe stemmed from the fact that it collided directly with the diplomatic reorientation of Britain under King Edward VII. To contemporaries, The monarch was not merely a ceremonial figurehead, but an unusually active player in shaping the tone and direction of British foreign policy. His reign, beginning in 1901, marked a departure from the splendid isolation that had characterized much of Queen Victoria's later years, when Britain relied on naval supremacy and colonial strength to remain aloof from continental entanglements. By the time Wilhelm rode through Tangier in March 1905, Edward's steady cultivation of European partnerships had already begun to alter the balance of power. The Entente Cordiale of 1904, although formally negotiated by foreign secretaries and ambassadors, bore the unmistakable imprint of Edward's personality and diplomacy. During his visits to Paris in 1903 and 1904, the king made deliberate efforts to charm both French officials and the broader public. He understood that centuries of Anglo-French rivalry, marked by colonial wars and mutual suspicion, had left deep scars on both sides. Yet he also recognized that Germany's rapid rise and the assertiveness of Wilhelm II had created a shared interest between Britain and France. By setting aside disputes over Egypt, Morocco, Newfoundland fisheries, and West African boundaries, Edward aimed to clear away obstacles that prevented broader cooperation. His tact, sociability, and willingness to flatter French sensibilities did much to reduce tensions, allowing the diplomatic machinery to finalize agreements that only a decade earlier would have seemed improbable. For Germany, this shift was profoundly unsettling. Berlin had long counted on Anglo-French rivalry as a structural feature of European politics. The assumption was that Britain, jealous of French colonial ambitions and wary of French naval development, would never align itself closely with its old enemy. Instead, Britain might be drawn toward Germany, with whom it shared both dynastic ties and overlapping interests in commerce. Wilhelm II himself, a grandson of Queen Victoria, frequently expressed his belief that Britain and Germany were natural allies, bound together by common heritage and industrial dynamism. The Entente Cordiale shattered this expectation. What had been a triangular balance now appeared increasingly as a dual alignment, with Britain and France edging closer, while Germany looked on with suspicion. Edward's role in this process was not purely symbolic. While the actual conduct of policy rested with Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne and the cabinet, the king's prestige and informal contacts carried real weight. His meetings with French leaders, his attention to ceremonial gestures, and his personal rapport with foreign monarchs lent credibility to the idea that Britain was moving out of isolation. At home, his support gave the Entente a degree of political legitimacy, reassuring critics that it was not merely a diplomatic contrivance but a genuine shift in orientation. Abroad, his presence at public events signaled continuity and commitment. France, long accustomed to viewing Britain as an opportunistic rival, took Edward's overtures as evidence of sincerity. The German reaction to this reorientation was immediate and negative. Chancellor von Bülow and the Wilhelmstrasse interpreted Edward's activism as part of a broader strategy to encircle Germany. They pointed not only to the Entente Cordiale, but also to Edward's cultivation of ties with Russia and Italy. Even though Britain had no formal alliance with St. Petersburg, Edward's conversations with Russian diplomats and his openness to future cooperation were interpreted as steps toward a wider coalition. In Berlin's view, the monarch was personally orchestrating a network of encirclement designed to contain German ambitions. This perception, whether accurate or exaggerated, heightened the sense of insecurity that lay behind Wilhelm's decision to make his stand in Tangier. When the Kaiser proclaimed Morocco's independence, therefore, the challenge was not directed solely at France. It was also a rebuke to Edward's diplomacy. By striking at the Entente's most recent arrangement, Wilhelm hoped to expose its fragility and demonstrate that Britain's king had built only a facade. If Britain hesitated to support France in a colonial quarrel, the entire edifice of Anglo-French rapprochement might collapse. The German calculation was that Edward's charm and diplomacy could not override Britain's traditional caution, particularly when the issue at stake, Moroccan reforms and policing, seemed far removed from vital British interests. But Edward's presence in the equation altered the dynamics. His personal involvement in cultivating the Entente meant that Britain's reputation, and by extension his own, was bound up in the outcome. A failure to support France would not simply weaken an agreement, It would undermine the king's entire project of drawing Britain back into continental diplomacy. Edward was acutely aware of this. Reports reaching London from Paris in the spring of 1905 emphasized French outrage and anxiety. The resignation of Delcasse, forced under German pressure, underscored the seriousness of the challenge. If Britain did not step forward, France risked humiliation, and the Entente might unravel before it had even taken root. The significance of Edward's diplomacy was thus magnified by the Moroccan crisis. In public, he remained above the fray, allowing Lansdowne and the cabinet to shape Britain's official responses. Yet behind the scenes, his insistence that Britain could not abandon France shaped the tone of policy. His influence reinforced the view, already present among senior officials, that Germany's maneuvering represented not merely a colonial dispute, but a deliberate attempt to disrupt the European balance. Britain's own interests, naval security, commercial access, and continental stability, were implicated. In Paris, this support carried weight. French leaders, shaken by Delcasse's fall and by the threat of German military pressure, took comfort in the signals from London. The press in both countries began to link their fates more explicitly, portraying the crisis as a confrontation not just between France and Germany, but between rival systems of diplomacy. The Anglo-French understanding, once tentative, gained substance as public opinion recognized that their interests were now intertwined. By the summer of 1905, therefore, the Moroccan crisis had become inseparable from the question of Edward VI's diplomacy. What had begun as a dispute over reforms in a distant sultanate had become a referendum on whether the Entente Cordiale would withstand its first test. Wilhelm's performance in Tangier, far from undermining Edward's network, had made its defense a matter of honor and necessity. The confrontation now carried implications not just for Morocco or even for France, but for the credibility of Britain's re-entry into continental politics. The events at Tangier did not arise from the Kaiser's impulses alone. Behind Wilhelm II's dramatic declaration of Moroccan independence stood a deliberate, if hazardous, strategy conceived in Berlin under Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow. German policy in 1905 was not guided by colonial ambitions in North Africa. Germany's commercial presence in Morocco remained modest compared with France or Britain, but rather by the desire to test the newly minted Entente Cordiale. The Moroccan question, incidental in itself, provided the arena for a diplomatic experiment to determine whether Britain would stand firm beside France or retreat into its traditional aloofness when faced with German pressure. Von Bülow and his advisors reasoned that Britain's interests in Morocco were not vital. London had secured its control of Egypt and the Suez Canal through the Entente, while Gibraltar ensured the security of the Western Mediterranean. France, by contrast, had staked prestige and strategic planning on extending its influence across the Maghreb. If Berlin could drive a wedge between the partners by forcing a confrontation in Morocco, France would be left exposed, and Britain would be reminded of the limits of continental engagement. The Entente, still young and untested, might collapse under pressure, restoring the older pattern of rivalries that had previously left Germany less isolated. This reasoning drew upon a wider German conviction that the Reich was being deliberately excluded from global decision-making. Since 1897, with the advent of Admiral Tirpitz's naval expansion program and the Kaiser's insistence on Weltpolitik, German leaders had sought recognition as a world power. Yet in practice, their influence was repeatedly constrained by existing empires. In China, the scramble for concessions after the Boxer Rebellion had left Germany with Kyotsky Bay, but Britain, Russia, and Japan overshadowed its role. In Africa, its colonies in East Africa, Southwest Africa, Cameroon, and Togo lacked the scale of French or British holdings. The Moroccan sphere, ostensibly open by virtue of the Madrid Convention of 1880, seemed a rare chance to insist on Germany's right to be consulted in shaping the international order. The gamble was thus as much about prestige as it was about policy. Von Bülow believed that France could be compelled to submit to an international conference, where Germany would demand equal rights and thereby undermine French claims. The goal was not to annex Morocco or to place it under German control, but to prevent Paris from establishing a protectorate unopposed. Success would demonstrate that the Reich could not be ignored in colonial matters. Failure, however, carried grave risks. It might expose Germany's diplomatic isolation and embolden its rivals. Within the German leadership, there was confidence that Britain would not sacrifice its freedom of maneuver for France. Von Bülow reminded the Reichstag that Britain had traditionally balanced between continental powers, never binding itself permanently. The Moroccan dispute, in his view, was a peripheral colonial quarrel that no British government would treat as worth the price of confrontation with Berlin. Even if Britain offered words of sympathy to Paris, the expectation in Berlin was that London would stop short of substantive support. In this way, the Moroccan crisis was intended as a stress test of Edward VI's diplomacy. Yet the strategy rested on assumptions that underestimated the degree of transformation underway in Anglo-French relations. British policymakers increasingly saw Germany's naval program and erratic foreign policy as the greater threat to their security, and they viewed the defense of France's position in Morocco as part of a larger struggle to check German assertiveness. Berlin misjudged not only London's intentions but also the effect of its own behavior. Wilhelm's flamboyant speech in Tangier and the aggressive tone of the German press convinced many in Britain that Germany was acting recklessly, seeking confrontation rather than balance. The gamble also revealed the internal contradictions of German foreign policy. Von Bülow, though cautious by temperament, was constrained by the Kaiser's appetite for dramatic gestures. Wilhelm relished the role of defender of Moroccan independence, casting himself as a champion of sovereignty against imperial greed. Such rhetoric, while useful domestically and appealing to Moroccan elites, risked escalating the confrontation beyond Berlin's initial calculations. Once the Kaiser had made his declaration, retreat without tangible gains would look like defeat. Thus Germany found itself committed to a harder line than perhaps intended, driven as much by prestige as by practical objectives. The first signs of strain appeared when Delcasse, France's foreign minister and chief architect of the Entente, refused to yield. He argued forcefully in cabinet that France must resist German interference, warning that to concede in Morocco would undermine the entire colonial system. Germany responded with threats of war, pressuring Paris until Delcasse resigned in June 1905. His fall was greeted in Berlin as vindication. The French government had been shaken, and Germany's firmness seemed to yield results. But the victory was deceptive. By forcing Delcasse's resignation, Berlin had hardened French opinion and alarmed Britain, which interpreted the move as evidence of Germany's willingness to use intimidation as an instrument of diplomacy. The gamble, therefore, began to deviate from its intended course. Instead of isolating France, Germany risked consolidating the Entente. Britain's press, already hostile to Berlin's naval expansion, reacted with suspicion and indignation at Wilhelm's tactics. Edward VII himself, though careful in public, communicated through diplomatic channels that London would not abandon its French partner. What Berlin had intended as a demonstration of weakness in the Entente was turning into its first serious test, and increasingly, a source of solidarity. Nevertheless, through the summer of 1905, Germany pressed ahead. Von Bülow insisted on the convening of an international conference to resolve the Moroccan question. Such a gathering, he believed, would place France on the defensive, compelled to justify its special position before the assembled powers. If Britain hesitated, the Entente might fracture under the strain. The stage was thus set for a showdown that would extend far beyond the Maghreb. The gamble, conceived in the offices of the Wilhelmstrasse and dramatized on the streets of Tangier, would soon shift to the negotiating tables of Europe, where the question was no longer simply Morocco, but the credibility of alliances themselves. The reverberations of Wilhelm's Tangier speech and Berlin's demand for an international conference struck Paris with unusual force. For France, the Moroccan issue touched nerves that went beyond colonial policy. It was bound up with questions of prestige, alliance credibility, and the memory of national humiliation at German hands in 1870–71. The French Republic, often divided internally by faction and ideology, discovered in the spring of 1905 that Germany's maneuver had exposed both its vulnerabilities and its potential sources of resilience. At the center of the storm stood Théophile Delcasse, the the foreign minister whose career had been devoted to rebuilding France's international position after the isolation that followed the Franco-Prussian War. Since assuming the post in 1898, Delcasse had pursued a deliberate strategy of securing alliances and understandings to counterbalance German power. He was the chief architect of the 1892 Franco-Russian alliance, and more recently, of the Entente Cordiale with Britain. To his mind, Morocco was not merely a colonial matter, but the test case for whether France could act with the confidence of a restored power. To yield under German pressure would be to return to the subservience of the 1870s, confirming the image of France as a secondary state. Delcasse argued passionately in cabinet meetings that France must resist. He dismissed Germany's invocation of international equality as a smokescreen designed to mask the humiliation of France and the weakening of the Entente. His stance, however, alarmed both moderates and military officials. Intelligence reports suggested that Berlin was prepared to mobilize if its demands were ignored. German newspapers spoke openly of war, while the Reichstag debated credits for increased armament. French generals, recalling the still painful memory of Sedan and the Commune, warned that France was not prepared for immediate conflict. Russia, the natural ally, had been weakened disastrously by its defeats in the Russo-Japanese War and was engulfed in domestic unrest following the Revolution of 1905. To count on Russian assistance was, in that moment, illusory. The domestic political context made Delcasse's position increasingly untenable. The French Chamber of Deputies, while broadly supportive of colonial expansion, was wary of confrontation that might expose the Republic to another German invasion. Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier, a cautious financier by temperament, favored a conciliatory line, arguing that France could not risk isolation. Delcasse's insistence on defiance clashed with Rouvier's determination to preserve peace at almost any cost. The result was a dramatic showdown within the government, with the cabinet divided over whether to stand firm or yield to German demands for a conference. By June 1905, the pressure became unbearable. German diplomats, emboldened by Wilhelm's intervention, delivered thinly veiled threats that if France refused to discuss Moroccan reforms in an international setting, Berlin would consider more forceful options. The French military staff, reviewing mobilization plans, admitted that the army was still undergoing reorganization and that immediate war could not be waged with confidence. The navy, though improved, was not yet equal to the combined German and Austro-Hungarian fleets in the Mediterranean. Faced with these realities, Rouvier concluded that confrontation was impossible. Delcasse, increasingly isolated, was forced to resign on June 6, 1905. His resignation was greeted in Berlin with jubilation. The German press hailed the fall of the chief plotter of encirclement, interpreting it as a sign that France had buckled under pressure. Wilhelm himself gloated privately that the Entente Cordiale was nothing more than a hollow facade if Britain allowed Delcasse to be sacrificed without response. In Paris, by contrast, the mood was one of humiliation. Newspapers that only weeks earlier had denounced German arrogance now turned their anger inward, lamenting that France had capitulated without a fight. Yet the apparent German victory masked deeper consequences. The removal of Delcasse did not dissolve the Entente. If anything, it dramatized for French opinion the necessity of securing British support. Rouvier's government, though conciliatory in tone, began working more closely with London to ensure that France would not stand alone in future crises. The sense of vulnerability, rather than prompting retreat, reinforced the determination of French statesmen to strengthen alliances. What Berlin had interpreted as a triumph of intimidation was in fact the beginning of a firmer Anglo-French alignment. The French public reaction was complex. On one hand, there was deep anger at the perception that Germany could dictate the composition of the French cabinet. On the other, there was relief that war had been averted at a moment of military unpreparedness. The army's deficiencies were openly debated in the press, and calls for rearmament gained momentum. The Moroccan crisis, instead of closing the colonial question, forced France to confront the broader reality that its national security still depended on allies and on rebuilding its strength against the German threat. Delcasse's fall also had ripple effects within Morocco itself. Sultan Abdelaziz, observing the resignation of the very minister who had sought to consolidate French influence, interpreted the development as evidence that Germany's support carried weight. He welcomed further German declarations, granting audiences to envoys and signaling openness to German commercial ventures. This emboldened Berlin to continue pressing for international arbitration, certain that the Sultan's symbolic gestures would buttress their claim to be defending Moroccan independence. For the French, the Sultan's maneuvering was an added humiliation, highlighting the degree to which Moroccan sovereignty had become a pawn in great power rivalry. What emerged in the summer of 1905, then, was a paradox. Germany had secured the resignation of the foreign minister most closely associated with the Entente, seemingly a diplomatic coup. But in doing so, it had exposed its methods of coercion, stiffened Anglo-French resolve, and revealed France's determination to avoid ever again being placed in so vulnerable a position. The shock in Paris was real, but it was not paralyzing. Instead, it became the catalyst for rearmament, alliance building, and a broader recognition that confrontation with Germany was likely inevitable. As the year wore on, the French government prepared itself for the international conference demanded by Berlin. Rouvier, though wary, accepted that the dispute could not be resolved without European mediation. Paris began shaping its strategy for Algeciras, aware that the outcome would determine whether France emerged humiliated or vindicated. At stake was not only Morocco, but the credibility of the Republic as a power capable of defending its interests on the international stage. As the crisis deepened in European capitals, its nominal subject, the Sultan of Morocco, was neither absent nor silent. Sultan Abdelaziz, who had inherited the throne at the age of 16, occupied a fragile position even before the confrontation between France and Germany turned his kingdom into the fulcrum of European diplomacy. His reign was characterized by efforts at limited modernization, but these measures were pursued against a backdrop of tribal fragmentation, fiscal weakness, and growing dependence on foreign powers. In the drama of 1905-06, Abdelaziz was less a decisive actor than a figure caught between forces far greater than his own, yet his decisions, invitations, and symbolic gestures mattered in shaping the form the crisis would take. Abdelaziz came to power after the death of his father, Sultan Hassan I, a ruler who had struggled to maintain Morocco's independence in the face of European encroachment. Hassan's careful balancing of rival powers, granting commercial concessions, signing treaties, and maintaining a posture of Islamic legitimacy, could not conceal the structural decline of the Moroccan. Revenue collection was erratic, dependent largely on agricultural taxes and arbitrary levies. The central government had little authority in the mountains of the Rif or the Sahara hinterland, where tribes maintained near autonomy. The Sultan's soldiers, poorly paid and equipped, could not effectively police the realm. By the turn of the 20th century, Morocco had become a coveted object of foreign attention precisely because of this weakness. European states competed for trade concessions, mining rights, and influence at court. The 1880 Madrid Convention had nominally guaranteed equal commercial access to all nations, but enforcement was lax, and France, with its Algerian and Tunisian footholds, enjoyed natural advantages. Abdelaziz, recognizing his vulnerability, sought to cultivate external supporters in hopes of offsetting French pressure. His instinct was to play one power against another, inviting advisors, engineers, and merchants from different countries so that no single state could dominate. Germany's intervention in 1905 thus offered him an opportunity. Wilhelm II's speech at Tangier, publicly affirming Morocco's independence and his personal esteem for Abdelaziz as sovereign, was received in Fez with satisfaction. The Sultan granted audiences to German representatives, welcomed their promises of support, and issued statements echoing his desire to preserve independence from encroaching foreign tutelage. For Abdelaziz, this was not simply flattery. He genuinely required a counterweight to France, whose proximity and growing assertiveness threatened to reduce Morocco to a protectorate in all but name. German backing, though distant and largely symbolic, offered at least the illusion of an alternative. Yet this embrace of German support came at a cost. It antagonized Paris, which had already invested diplomatic capital in the Entente with Britain and in a policy of gradual penetration of Morocco. French officials interpreted Abdelaziz's willingness to welcome German advisors as evidence of ingratitude and unreliability. The very monarch whose independence they claimed to respect was, in their eyes, jeopardizing the carefully constructed colonial settlement of 1904. In this sense, Abdelaziz found himself used as a pawn. Each move toward Berlin made him more vulnerable to French hostility, while each concession to Paris risked alienating German protection. Domestically, too, his gestures were double-edged. Many Moroccan notables were skeptical of his reforms, which included modest steps toward modernization, such as the introduction of European-style uniforms for the army, the purchase of bicycles and cameras, and attempts at administrative centralization. Conservative elements viewed his fascination with European novelties as frivolous and un-Islamic. When he leaned openly on German assurances in 1905, his critics argued that he was compromising Morocco's independence by inviting in yet another foreign sponsor. Thus, while Wilhelm's support bolstered Abdelaziz diplomatically, it weakened him internally by reinforcing the perception that he was a monarch beholden to outsiders. For the European chancelleries, Abdelaziz's position became a bargaining chip. Berlin cited his sovereignty to argue for international involvement in Moroccan reforms, insisting that the Sultan himself sought guarantees against domination by any one power. Paris, while acknowledging his legitimacy, emphasized the need for order and stability, which only France, as Morocco's nearest European neighbor, could provide. Britain, though less directly involved, accepted French reasoning, seeing Abdelaziz's instability as a risk to Mediterranean security. Spain, which still clung to enclaves at Ceuta and Melilla, pressed its own claims for influence. Each of these perspectives reduced the Sultan's role to that of a symbolic figure whose independence justified conflicting policies. Abdelaziz himself attempted to steer through the crisis with careful rhetoric. In audiences and proclamations, he spoke of his desire to modernize Morocco without sacrificing tradition, and of his gratitude to all powers who respected his independence. Yet the contradictions of his position were plain. To accept German support was to risk French hostility. To lean toward France was to lose German backing. His ministers, divided between factions, offered conflicting advice, some urging closer alignment with Paris, others advocating a broader balancing act. The result was paralysis. Morocco remained incapable of meaningful reform, while its sovereignty became ever more entangled in European designs. The irony was that Morocco's internal condition, far from being addressed, deteriorated as the crisis unfolded. Smuggling, piracy, and tribal insurrections continued unabated. Revenue shortfalls left the treasury dependent on foreign loans, often under unfavorable terms. The Sultan's attempts to modernize his army were hampered by lack of funds and training. Each new concession to foreigners, whether railway contracts, mining rights, or banking arrangements, fueled suspicion among his subjects that he was selling Morocco piecemeal. In this sense, the crisis of 1905 was not only about European rivalry, but also about the slow erosion of the Moroccan state from within. Still, Abdelaziz's role should not be dismissed as wholly passive. His reception of German envoys and his willingness to echo their rhetoric of independence provided Berlin with the legitimacy it needed to press for a conference. Without the Sultan's apparent consent, Germany's claim to be defending sovereignty would have rung hollow. Likewise, his continued recognition of French economic interests prevented Berlin from portraying Morocco as an exclusively German client. His maneuvering, though constrained, mattered because it supplied the diplomatic raw material upon which European powers constructed their arguments. By the autumn of 1905, Abdelaziz had become a monarch under siege, not by armies at his gates, but by the competing attentions of foreign chancelleries. His court at Fez, already riven by intrigue, was now the object of incessant visits from diplomats, advisors, and commercial agents. Each sought assurances that Morocco's independence, as defined in their own capitals, would be preserved. Each read into Abdelaziz's ambiguous gestures the endorsement they desired. The Sultan's role in the crisis was therefore paradoxical. Simultaneously the sovereign at the center of the dispute, and a pawn whose independence was bartered away in negotiations far beyond his control. As Europe moved inexorably toward the conference at Algeciras, Abdelaziz's significance lay less in what he could decide than in what he represented. To Germany, he was the emblem of sovereign independence requiring international defense. To France, he was the weak ruler whose incapacity justified intervention. To Britain, he was a potential destabilizer of the Mediterranean balance. And to his own people, he was increasingly the monarch whose attempts at modernization threatened to dissolve the very independence he claimed to uphold. While Sultan Abdelaziz struggled to balance his precarious position inside Morocco, the chancelleries of Europe watched with growing anxiety. The crisis was no longer perceived as a colonial dispute, but as a test of the European balance of power. What gave the confrontation such resonance was the sense, widely shared among diplomats and statesmen, that the Moroccan issue might serve as the spark for a general war. Each capital measured its position not only in terms of Moroccan trade or strategic access, but also in relation to the wider question of alliance credibility. Austria-Hungary was the first major power to signal alignment with Berlin. Bound to Germany by the dual alliance of 1879, Vienna's dependence on its northern neighbor for protection against Russia was absolute. Yet the Habsburg monarchy approached the Moroccan crisis with caution. The empire faced its own difficulties: nationalist unrest in Hungary, mounting tension in the Balkans, and the need to keep a wary eye on Russian influence among the Slavs. For Count Agenor Galachowski, the foreign minister, unconditional support for Germany risked embroiling Austria-Hungary in a colonial confrontation far from its interests. Nonetheless, the logic of the alliance prevailed. Vienna endorsed Germany's demand for an international conference and signaled it would back Berlin diplomatically, though without enthusiasm. This support mattered less for the weight it added to Germany's case than for the symbolism of Allied solidarity. Berlin could at least claim that it was not entirely isolated. Italy, the third member of the Triple Alliance, was less dependable. Rome had long-standing ambitions in North Africa, particularly in Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, which were still under Ottoman sovereignty, but increasingly viewed as Italy's destined colonies. In the Moroccan dispute, Italian leaders hesitated. To support Germany risked antagonizing France, with whom Italy had reached secret understandings to avoid clashes in the Mediterranean. Antonio Tittoni, Italy's foreign minister, balanced carefully. He formally upheld alliance commitments to Germany while discreetly assuring Paris that Italy would not obstruct French interests in Morocco. In practice, Italy's stance revealed the fragility of the Triple Alliance, which, though formidable on paper, concealed diverging interests and latent rivalries. Russia, bound to France since the 1890s, was in no position to intervene decisively. The catastrophe of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05 had crippled its military prestige, culminating in the destruction of its fleet at Tsushima and the humiliating Treaty of Portsmouth. Simultaneously, revolution convulsed the empire, forcing Nicholas II to grant the October Manifesto and experiment with a Duma. Russian diplomats, preoccupied with domestic survival, could offer France only rhetorical solidarity. This weakness underscored Paris's vulnerability. Its one formal ally was incapacitated, leaving it dependent on Britain's still untested commitment under the Entente Cordiale. Smaller states watched the crisis with dread. Belgium, whose neutrality had been guaranteed by the great powers since 1839, feared that any general European war might make it the first battlefield, given its strategic location between France and Germany. The Netherlands, equally vulnerable, pursued strict neutrality while reinforcing its coastal defenses. In Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway observed developments warily, aware that naval conflict in the North Sea could draw them into the maelstrom. Even Switzerland, proudly neutral, recorded alarm in its diplomatic correspondence, noting that a war over Morocco would likely escalate beyond colonial questions into a continent-wide conflict. The United States, though geographically distant, did not remain indifferent. President Theodore Roosevelt, architect of the Roosevelt Corollary and eager to demonstrate American influence on the world stage, followed the crisis with interest. Washington had little direct stake in Morocco, but American diplomats signaled sympathy for international arbitration and increasingly for French claims. For Roosevelt, participation in the eventual Algeciras Conference promised an opportunity to assert the United States as a global power, not confined to the Western Hemisphere. This tentative American involvement, though modest, added to Germany's sense of isolation. In London, the crisis was debated with intensity. Edward VI's diplomacy had raised expectations in Paris, but the cabinet still hesitated to define Britain's obligations precisely. Foreign Secretary Lansdowne and Prime Minister Balfour were cautious, seeking to avoid entanglement in a continental quarrel while preserving the Entente's credibility. Public opinion, however, moved more rapidly. The British press, alarmed by Wilhelm's theatrics and by German demands couched in the language of threats, took a strongly anti-German line. Newspapers such as The Times warned that Germany's attempt to dictate terms in Morocco was a rehearsal for future aggression in Europe. Cartoons portrayed Wilhelm as a reckless gambler endangering the peace of Europe. This press campaign, amplified by Edward VI's private assurances to French leaders, created a climate in which official policy leaned increasingly toward active support for Paris. For Berlin, this reaction was alarming. Von Bülow had expected that Britain's government, mindful of its global empire and cautious of continental entanglements, would restrain Paris. Instead, the opposite seemed to be happening. The crisis was drawing Britain and France closer. Even Italy's ambiguity and Austria-Hungary's half-hearted backing could not compensate for the growing sense that the Entente was hardening into a genuine counterweight. The Moroccan dispute, intended as a lever to pry apart Britain and France, risked becoming the glue that bound them together. The perception that Europe stood on the brink of war intensified throughout the summer and autumn of 1905. In Berlin, military leaders prepared contingency plans for rapid mobilization. In Paris, General Staff officers admitted that France could not face Germany alone and pressed for clear assurances from Britain. In London, the Admiralty quietly reviewed fleet dispositions, anticipating that any war on the continent would quickly spill into the North Sea and Mediterranean. Diplomatic cables multiplied, each side probing the others for signals of resolve or weakness. What made the situation particularly volatile was the absence of trust. Germany believed that France and Britain sought to encircle it. France feared that Germany intended to dictate terms by intimidation. Britain suspected that Germany's ambitions extended beyond Morocco to the very balance of power in Europe. Each interpretation contained elements of truth, and each encouraged worst-case planning. The Moroccan Sultan, whose independence was ostensibly the cause of dispute, became an afterthought in the broader calculations of war and alliance. By late 1905, it was clear that only a multilateral settlement could prevent escalation. The proposal for an international conference, pressed insistently by Berlin and reluctantly accepted by Paris, gained traction as the least dangerous alternative. European capitals recognized that while war had not yet broken out, the credibility of alliances had been tested in ways that could not be forgotten. The Moroccan crisis had become a rehearsal for the larger confrontation that many now considered inevitable. By the end of 1905, the Moroccan crisis had clarified a central truth. France could not weather German pressure alone. The resignation of Delcasse had exposed this vulnerability with brutal clarity, and though Paris moved to present a calmer, more conciliatory face to Europe, the undercurrent of humiliation was unmistakable. France's leaders understood that without external support, particularly from London, they risked being forced into further concessions at the coming conference. It was at this moment, as the balance tilted precariously, that Britain began to step forward more decisively, transforming the Entente Cordiale from a diplomatic convenience into the nucleus of a true alignment. The catalyst for Britain's shift was a combination of royal diplomacy, public opinion, and strategic calculation. Edward VII had already invested his prestige in the Anglo-French understanding. To abandon France in its hour of need would not merely expose Paris, but also discredit the king's wider effort to reinsert Britain into continental affairs. His private correspondence with French President Émile Loubet and Premier Maurice Rouvier throughout mid-1905 carried the same underlying message. Britain would not allow France to be humiliated. These assurances were conveyed not through formal commitments, which the cabinet still hesitated to articulate, but through the quiet, steady voice of monarchical diplomacy. To French ears, Edward's words suggested continuity, reliability, and solidarity. Meanwhile, the British press amplified the sense of confrontation. The Times and the Daily Telegraph warned readers that Germany's actions in Morocco were part of a broader pattern of belligerence, linked to its naval expansion and its ambition to alter the European balance. Editorials stressed that Britain's own security depended on preventing Berlin from establishing a precedent of coercion. Cartoons of the period depicted Kaiser Wilhelm as a meddler thrusting his sword into the affairs of others, while portraying France as a besieged partner deserving support. This hostile climate left the cabinet little room to retreat. To stand aloof would have risked accusations of weakness and invited German adventurism elsewhere. Strategically, Britain's calculations were shaped by the Admiralty and the Foreign Office. Naval planners emphasized that German assertiveness in Morocco might foreshadow future challenges closer to home. If Berlin succeeded in splitting the Entente and demonstrating that Britain would not stand beside its partners, Germany's leverage in Europe would increase correspondingly. The Foreign Office, led by Lord Lansdowne, concluded that maintaining the credibility of the Entente was more important than the Moroccan question itself. The crisis was less about North Africa than about alliance dynamics. If Britain failed to support France now, its influence in continental politics would evaporate, and Berlin would dictate the future balance unopposed. Edward VII's role in consolidating this perspective was subtle but significant. During private conversations with ministers, he reminded them of the broader diplomatic context. Germany's naval laws of 1898 and 1900, its erratic diplomacy in China and the Near East, and its growing sense of grievance against Britain's empire. In the king's view, the Moroccan crisis was a symptom of Germany's larger ambition to reconfigure Europe. To acquiesce to Berlin in 1905 was to invite greater crises later. His arguments, couched in the language of prudence and foresight, reinforced the inclination of policymakers already leaning toward support for France. The effect of Britain's stance became evident in late 1905 as preparations for the Algeciras Conference advanced. German diplomats had counted on London's reluctance to involve itself deeply in continental quarrels. Instead, they found Britain acting with increasing clarity. Lansdowne assured Paris that Britain would not permit France to be isolated at the conference. The British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Frank Lascelles, delivered carefully worded warnings that London would resist any attempt to coerce France. These communications, though measured, were unmistakable in their implication. Germany's gamble to split the Entente was failing. France drew strength from this shift. Though still anxious about its military weakness and the unreliability of Russia, Paris began to prepare for the conference with renewed confidence. French diplomats coordinated closely with their British counterparts, aligning positions and drafting proposals designed to preserve France's predominant role in Moroccan policing while conceding the principle of international oversight in commercial matters. The aim was not to exclude Germany entirely, but to ensure that its voice remained secondary to that of the Entente. In this way, French strategy mirrored British interests, to avoid war, but also to prevent Berlin from claiming a decisive victory. The British press campaign reinforced this diplomacy by shaping public opinion in ways that limited the cabinet's flexibility. By autumn, leading newspapers openly described Britain and France as standing together against German arrogance. The notion that the Entente was a fragile convenience gave way to the impression of a genuine partnership forged under pressure. German newspapers took note, bitterly denouncing what they called the king's encirclement policy. The phrase captured the essence of Berlin's fear, that Britain, by aligning with France and cultivating ties with Russia, was constructing a diplomatic wall around Germany. What made Britain's intervention decisive was not the size of its military or the immediacy of its commitments. No formal alliance yet bound London to Paris, but the psychological reassurance it offered. France, reeling from Delcasse's resignation, might otherwise have entered the conference demoralized and pliable. Instead, bolstered by the knowledge that Britain stood behind it, Paris could resist German demands with firmness. For Germany, this was the turning point. The expectation that Britain would hesitate had been the foundation of the Tangier gamble, and that foundation was now crumbling. As the year closed, the alignment of forces was clearer than ever. Germany could count only on Austria-Hungary's half-hearted support. Italy was evasive, Russia incapacitated, and the United States inclined toward arbitration rather than confrontation. Britain's step forward transformed the diplomatic landscape. The Entente Cordiale was no longer an experiment, but a functioning partnership tested by crisis. The Moroccan question, ostensibly about reforms in a distant sultanate, had become the crucible in which Europe's emerging alliance blocs were forged. Thus, on the eve of the Algeciras Conference, The stage was set for a confrontation not merely of policy, but of prestige. Germany, having demanded a conference as proof of its influence, now faced the prospect of isolation within it. France, once shaken, prepared to defend its claims with the backing of Britain. Edward VII's diplomacy had altered the trajectory of the crisis. What began as a German attempt to unravel the Entente was turning into the event that confirmed its resilience. The next phase of the drama would unfold not in the streets of Tangier or the halls of Fez, but in the Spanish city of Algeciras, where 13 powers would gather to determine whether Morocco's fate could be resolved without plunging Europe into war. By late 1905, the Moroccan crisis had entered a new and perilous phase. What had begun with the Kaiser's theatrical declaration in Tangier and the subsequent fall of Algeciras in Paris was now converging upon a broader diplomatic stage. The demand for an international conference, Berlin's original objective, had been accepted, but in a manner that suggested weakness rather than triumph. France, far from capitulating, was preparing to defend its position with renewed determination, fortified by Britain's steady support. Germany, having forced the issue, could not retreat without losing prestige, yet found itself increasingly isolated. The approach to the conference at Algeciras in southern Spain thus became a tense prelude, marked by maneuver, preparation, and the quiet, relentless calculation of chancelleries across Europe. The choice of Algeciras, a small port opposite Gibraltar, was symbolic. It was selected partly for reasons of neutrality. Neither Paris nor Berlin could dominate the proceedings there, and partly because Spain, as a minor but interested party in Moroccan affairs, could host without appearing partial. For France, the location was acceptable, a compromise that avoided the humiliation of negotiations in Berlin. For Germany, it was tolerable so long as the principle of international arbitration was preserved. For Britain, the site offered convenient access and, not incidentally, proximity to the Royal Navy's Mediterranean base at Gibraltar, a subtle reminder of naval strength should the discussions break down. In the weeks leading up to the conference, Europe lived in an atmosphere of nervous expectancy. German diplomats worked feverishly to shore up support. Berlin courted Italy, reminding Rome of its formal alliance obligations under the Triple Alliance. Yet Italian leaders, conscious of their understandings with France and their ambitions in Libya, gave only vague assurances. The Austrian government, as expected, pledged its solidarity, but Vienna's commitment was limited to diplomatic backing. Beyond this, Germany discovered that its appeals fell largely on deaf ears. Russia, weakened and distracted, could not intervene. The United States, courted by both sides, declared its interest in arbitration, but leaned increasingly toward the Anglo-French position. Smaller states, Belgium, Portugal, the Netherlands, sought safety and neutrality, unwilling to antagonize either bloc. France, by contrast, prepared meticulously. Rouvier's government, though cautious, instructed its diplomats to hold firm on the principle that France possessed special responsibilities in Morocco, particularly in matters of policing and reform. Paris sought to present its position not as a colonial grab, but as a stabilizing necessity. The Algerian frontier provided a ready argument. Unrest in Morocco directly endangered French security. Britain quietly endorsed this reasoning, though it advised moderation in tone. The objective, as Lansdowne and Edward VII stressed, was not to humiliate Germany, but to demonstrate that the Entente could withstand pressure. Public opinion mirrored these diplomatic preparations. In Germany, the press adopted a defiant tone, insisting that the fatherland would not tolerate exclusion from Moroccan affairs. The nationalist Pan-German League portrayed the conference as a test of Germany's rightful place among world powers, warning against surrender. In France, newspapers urged vigilance, depicting Germany as a bully intent on undermining French honor. The British press, still inflamed by the memory of Tangier, emphasized the danger of German militarism, portraying the Entente as the defender of European equilibrium. Across Europe, readers followed the crisis as though awaiting the outcome of a duel, each day's dispatch adding to the sense of impending confrontation. Behind these public positions lay the quieter, but equally significant military calculations. In Berlin, the General Staff reviewed mobilization timetables, wary that a breakdown at Algeciras might trigger hostilities. The army was confident of rapid success against France if war came, but strategists worried about Britain's role. Would the Royal Navy intervene, closing Germany's access to the Atlantic? In Paris, The staff admitted that France could not fight alone, but began tentative discussions with London about possible military coordination, a development unthinkable only a few years earlier. Although no formal agreements were concluded, the very act of such conversations signaled how far the Entente had progressed. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals the deep mistrust shaping every move. German officials spoke of encirclement, convinced that Edward VII was orchestrating a coalition to contain Germany. French diplomats described Germany as reckless, warning that concessions would only encourage further aggression. British ministers oscillated between caution and firmness, but the prevailing view was that credibility demanded consistency. To abandon France now would undermine Britain's standing globally, not merely in Europe. Each side, in short, approached Algeciras determined to prove a point beyond Morocco itself. The Sultan, meanwhile, remained a figure on the margins of his own fate. Abdelaziz issued polite statements welcoming international concern for Morocco's independence, but he had little means to shape the outcome. His envoys in Europe were treated with courtesy, yet their role was largely ceremonial. The real contest was between the great powers, and the Sultan's sovereignty served primarily as the legal fiction around which competing claims were justified. As the new year approached, the atmosphere grew heavier. In December 1905, newspapers speculated openly about the possibility of war should the conference fail. Financial markets reacted nervously, with bond prices fluctuating on rumors of mobilization. Governments reassured the public that peace would be preserved, but the undertone of uncertainty persisted. Diplomats understood that the stakes were higher than the Moroccan reforms. They involved the credibility of alliances, the prestige of monarchs, and the willingness of powers to risk confrontation. By January 1906, as delegations prepared to travel to Spain, the lines were clear. Germany demanded that Moroccan reforms, particularly the training of police and control of customs, be placed under international supervision, limiting French predominance. France insisted on its special position as Morocco's immediate neighbor and guardian of order, supported quietly but firmly by Britain. Austria-Hungary pledged to stand with Berlin, Italy remained evasive, and the United States, Spain, and other minor powers prepared to mediate. The stage was set for a confrontation in which every clause of discussion would carry implications for Europe's future alignment. Thus, the road to Algeciras was not merely a diplomatic itinerary, but a passage into a new era of European politics. The crisis had already demonstrated that Germany's confidence in Britain's aloofness was misplaced, and that the Entente Cordiale could act with cohesion under pressure. The coming conference would test these conclusions formally, placing them in the crucible of negotiation. What had begun as a theatrical gesture in Tangier was now to be adjudicated in a Spanish port city, where the fate of Moroccan reforms would serve as proxy for the balance of power in the 20th century. On January 16, 1906, the International Conference on Morocco formally convened in the small Andalusian city of Algeciras. For the next 3 months, the modest Spanish port, ordinarily a quiet town overlooking the Bay of Gibraltar, became the epicenter of European diplomacy. 13 powers gathered: Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Britain, Spain, Italy, Russia, the United States, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, and Morocco itself. Their presence underscored the gravity of the crisis. What had begun as a quarrel over colonial influence now required the collective attention of nearly every significant state in the Western world. The opening sessions revealed the tense atmosphere. Delegates arrived with carefully scripted instructions, their positions shaped not only by national interests in Morocco, but also by the broader rivalries of European politics. The German delegation, led by Baron von Radowitz, carried Wilhelm II's mandate to defend Moroccan independence by insisting on international control of reforms. France, represented by Stephen Pichon and supported by Britain's Sir Arthur Nicholson, insisted that while Moroccan sovereignty was to be respected in theory, the practical necessity of order and security required recognition of France's special position. Spain, as host and a traditional stakeholder in northern Morocco, sought to preserve influence while avoiding open conflict with either side. The United States, represented by Ambassador Henry White, entered as an interested observer, its role undefined but potentially decisive. The first procedural questions already foreshadowed deeper disagreements. Germany insisted that the conference had been convened precisely to ensure that no single power dominated Moroccan reforms. It pressed for collective oversight of policing, finance, and customs, a system that would dilute French influence and elevate Germany's standing. France countered that as Morocco's immediate neighbor, it bore the burden of unrest on the Algerian frontier and could not abdicate responsibility for maintaining stability. Britain endorsed this reasoning, framing the French position as one of practical necessity rather than imperial greed. Tension in the chamber was palpable. Behind each delegate stood not merely a government, but also public opinion and military preparations at home. In Berlin, Wilhelm II followed reports obsessively, demanding updates on each exchange. The German press portrayed the conference as a tribunal in which France would be forced to justify its ambitions. In Paris, editors warned against capitulation, declaring that national honor was at stake. London's newspapers, no less engaged, insisted that Britain must stand shoulder to shoulder with its partner lest Germany dictate Europe's future. The Sultan's representatives, though present, were largely marginal to the proceedings. Abdelaziz had sent envoys with instructions to defend Morocco's sovereignty, but they lacked both the authority and the leverage to shape decisions. Their interventions, formal appeals to independence, promises of reform, were treated respectfully but carried little weight. Everyone understood that the fate of Moroccan sovereignty would be decided not in Fez or Tangier, but in Algeciras, under the gaze of the great powers. As debates unfolded, the central issue became policing. France argued that unrest along the frontier, smuggling, and tribal resistance required a modern police force trained and equipped by a reliable power. Germany, wary of conceding such authority, proposed that control of the police be entrusted to a multinational body, with officers from neutral countries to ensure impartiality. Austria-Hungary supported Berlin's stance, while Britain, Spain, and Italy leaned toward the French proposal, albeit with modifications. The United States, seeking a mediating role, signaled that it would favor compromise but not at the expense of undermining French security needs. Every session was shadowed by the threat of breakdown. German delegates, determined to project firmness, spoke in tones that verged on confrontation. They reminded the Assembly that the principle of equal rights among nations, established at the Madrid Convention of 1880, could not be ignored. France countered that the Madrid framework was outdated, that conditions in Morocco had deteriorated, and that only a power with both capacity and interest could restore order. Britain reinforced this line, warning that abstract principles could not substitute for practical responsibility. The Spanish host sought to mediate. Foreign Minister Segismundo Moret appealed for moderation, urging delegates to avoid turning Morocco into a pretext for war. Spanish diplomats proposed formulas by which Moroccan sovereignty would be reaffirmed, while limited reforms were introduced under international supervision, with France and Spain playing primary roles. This compromise framework gradually gained traction, though Germany resisted, fearing it would amount to tacit recognition of French predominance. Outside the conference hall, social interactions carried as much weight as formal sessions. Delegates dined, walked, and conversed in smaller groups, seeking to test each other's intentions. The French and British delegations coordinated closely, holding nightly consultations to align strategy. German representatives, increasingly aware of their isolation, cultivated the Austrians and courted the Americans, hoping to build a counterweight. Yet the pattern of alignment was unmistakable. Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and eventually even the United States leaned in one direction, leaving Germany and Austria increasingly alone. What gave these alignments significance was not merely the Moroccan issue, but the broader perception of credibility. If Germany retreated, its bluff would be exposed. If France yielded, the Entente Cordiale would be discredited. Thus, every clause of debate, every amendment proposed, carried symbolic weight beyond the narrow question at hand. The conference chamber became a stage on which the future of European alliances was performed. Through February and into March, negotiations continued in this tense atmosphere. Draft proposals circulated, revised, and amended, but the essential lines remained fixed. Germany insisting on internationalization, France and Britain on recognition of France's role. American mediation, carefully deployed, sought to bridge the gap by proposing that police training be shared between France and Spain under nominal international oversight. This formula allowed Germany to claim that sovereignty was preserved while granting France the practical control it required. As the conference moved toward its conclusion, the balance of forces was clear. Germany's insistence on equal rights had been heard but not embraced. Even minor powers, wary of antagonizing Britain and France, preferred compromise to confrontation. The very structure of the gathering had revealed what Berlin most feared: that its rivals, despite their differences, could align when confronted with German pressure. Thus, when the conference finally neared agreement, it was evident that Germany had overreached. The opening of Algeciras, intended as a demonstration of Berlin's power to force France onto the defensive, had instead exposed its own diplomatic weakness. The Sultan's sovereignty was affirmed in words, but in practice, France and Spain would oversee Moroccan policing, under the thin veil of international approval. The great gamble that had begun in Tangier was unraveling in the gilded halls of Algeciras. Although King Edward VII never set foot in Algeciras, his presence was felt in every corridor and calculation. The British monarch had long cultivated the image of a genial peacemaker, skilled in the arts of ceremony and charm, but by 1906 his influence was understood as something more formidable: the architect of Britain's return to European diplomacy. To the German delegation, Edward's absence from the conference hall did not diminish his role, it magnified it. They saw his hand in every alignment that seemed to coalesce against them. From the outset of the proceedings, the Anglo-French partnership operated with an ease that reflected Edward's patient diplomacy over the preceding years. French and British representatives coordinated arguments and proposals almost instinctively, their solidarity a public display of Entente cohesion. For Paris, this cooperation was vital reassurance. The humiliation of Algeciras' fall had left deep scars, and French officials entered Algeciras wary of isolation. But each time British delegates rose to echo French reasoning, emphasizing stability, frontier security, and the practical necessity of a strong guiding hand in Morocco, the old fears receded. What had once been a fragile understanding between two rival powers now looked increasingly like a dependable alignment. In Berlin, this sight provoked bitterness. Kaiser Wilhelm II complained in private correspondence that his uncle, the British king, had become the chief mischief maker of Europe. German officials referred to Edward's web of encirclement, convinced that he was orchestrating a grand coalition designed to hem Germany in. The Kaiser's frustration was heightened by his own kinship ties. He had once imagined dynastic connections would draw Britain closer, only to discover that personal relations had become a vehicle for Edward to strengthen bonds with Germany's rivals. To Wilhelm, the Moroccan crisis confirmed that Edward's diplomacy was not casual but deliberate, aimed at diminishing Germany's freedom of action. Yet Edward's influence was not limited to perceptions in Berlin. Within the conference itself, his reputation shaped the behavior of neutral powers. Delegates from Italy, Spain, and even the United States judged British assurances to be credible precisely because they associated them with the king's personal commitment. Edward had established himself as a visible, active monarch on the European stage, unlike his more reticent mother in her later years. The memory of his visits to Paris, Rome, and Madrid lingered. Leaders and diplomats alike recalled the deliberate warmth of his conversations, the gestures of respect he paid to national traditions, and the way he cultivated trust. In the charged atmosphere of Algeciras, these impressions mattered. For Spain, hosting the conference, Edward's shadow offered reassurance that Britain would not allow the proceedings to collapse into chaos. King Alfonso XIII, young and ambitious, admired Edward's statesmanship and quietly aligned his government with Anglo-French proposals. Italy, though formally tied to Germany through the Triple Alliance, judged that offending Edward carried greater risks than disappointing Berlin. Rome's calculations in part reflected the king's careful attention to Italian interests during his visits, where he had expressed sympathy for Italy's Mediterranean ambitions. Even across the Atlantic, the American delegation found Edward's diplomacy relevant. President Theodore Roosevelt, who prided himself on his role as an international mediator after the Russo-Japanese War, respected Edward as a fellow practitioner of personal diplomacy. Ambassador Henry White's readiness to lean toward compromise with France was eased by the sense that Britain's monarch was invested in preserving stability. For Roosevelt, Edward represented continuity and predictability in European politics, qualities the United States valued as it cautiously extended its global role. Within Britain itself, the monarch's shadow loomed over cabinet deliberations. Officially, foreign policy remained the province of the government, but ministers were acutely aware that the king's prestige was bound up in the Entente. Edward's earlier triumphal reception in Paris had made the alignment popular with the French public. To allow it to falter now would have embarrassed not only France but also the crown. The cabinet thus operated with the implicit understanding that Edward's diplomatic project must be preserved. This constraint shaped Lansdowne's instructions to British delegates. While avoiding provocations, they were to give France steady, visible support at every stage. To Germany, this invisible influence was intolerable. The Reich's diplomats discovered that their appeals to principles of equality and independence found little traction once Britain and France presented a united front. Austria-Hungary stood beside Berlin, but with little enthusiasm and no real leverage. Italy equivocated, the United States mediated, Spain leaned westward, and Russia, though weakened, still lent moral weight to Paris. The more Germany pressed, the more it appeared that Edward's design of concentric friendships was bearing fruit. The irony was that Edward himself had no formal seat at Algeciras and issued no instructions to the delegates beyond his government's policy. His role was indirect, the accumulated effect of years of travel, conversation, and tactful reassurance. Yet it was precisely this informality that magnified his shadow. Diplomats believed they were witnessing the fruits of a deliberate royal strategy, and Germany confirmed the perception by repeatedly blaming him for their predicament. The Kaiser's denunciations only reinforced the sense that Edward, though absent, was decisive. As the sessions wore on into February, the conference increasingly resembled a contest between Germany's stridency and the quiet weight of Edwardian diplomacy. The German delegation, frustrated by its lack of allies, delivered speeches in uncompromising tones, warning against monopolies and demanding genuine international control. Yet each proposal was met with carefully coordinated Anglo-French responses, reinforced by neutral states unwilling to alienate Britain. The impression took root that Germany was isolated not merely by circumstance, but by the deliberate architecture of Edward's encirclement. By March, as compromise proposals began to circulate, Berlin's isolation was undeniable. France secured recognition of its role in Moroccan policing, shared with Spain, while the principle of international oversight was preserved largely as a face-saving device. Britain's support had been decisive, and that support was widely credited to Edward VII's patient work in the years leading up to the crisis. The monarch who once seemed a genial figure of society had, by the midpoint of his reign, become Europe's quiet strategist. Thus, even as the conference moved toward resolution, Germany's resentment deepened. For Wilhelm and his advisors, the Moroccan crisis did not simply expose diplomatic isolation. It personalized the humiliation. They believed they had been outmaneuvered not only by France's persistence, but by the guiding hand of a British king who never set foot in the conference chamber. This perception, whether accurate or exaggerated, would linger, feeding the bitterness with which Germany viewed the Anglo-French rapprochement in the years leading up to 1914. By the middle of the Algeciras Conference, the shape of Europe's alignments had become unmistakable. Germany, which had entered the Moroccan crisis with the expectation of exposing the fragility of the Entente Cordiale, now found itself increasingly alone. The very strategy designed to reassert its diplomatic influence had instead revealed the limits of its reach. Isolation was not merely a matter of numbers within the conference chamber, but of perception. In the eyes of Europe, Germany had overplayed its hand, and in so doing strengthened the cohesion of its rivals. The German delegation, led by Baron von Radowitz and later reinforced by Chancellor von Bülow's instructions from Berlin, clung to the principle that Morocco must remain an independent state under genuine international supervision. On paper, this position appeared reasonable. The Madrid Convention of 1880 had guaranteed equal commercial rights for all nations, and Germany argued that the French attempt to monopolize Moroccan policing was a violation of that framework. Yet the tone in which these arguments were delivered, unyielding, combative, and often dismissive of compromise, alienated potential sympathizers. Even states with little enthusiasm for French predominance recoiled from appearing to side openly with Berlin. Austria-Hungary remained Germany's only firm supporter. Count Alois Lexa von Ehrenthal, the Habsburg delegate, echoed Berlin's insistence on internationalization, but Vienna's motives were transparent. The dual alliance compelled Austria-Hungary to back its partner, and its own interests in North Africa were negligible. The support therefore carried little persuasive power. It demonstrated loyalty, not conviction. Italy, though formally bound by the Triple Alliance, grew increasingly evasive. Rome's real ambitions lay in Tripolitania, and antagonizing France risked complicating those designs. Italian delegates offered perfunctory statements of sympathy for German principles, but quietly aligned with Anglo-French proposals in drafting sessions. This half-heartedness, keenly observed by all, underlined Germany's narrowing circle. Even more damaging was the stance of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, initially inclined toward neutrality, signaled through Ambassador Henry White that Washington favored a practical settlement. The American delegation leaned toward the Anglo-French compromise, policing to be handled by France and Spain under nominal international oversight. For Berlin, this was a bitter disappointment. German officials had hoped that the United States, with its professed commitment to open trade and sovereignty, might side with them. Instead, Washington chose stability over confrontation, adding weight to the majority forming against Germany. The cumulative effect of these alignments was stark. One by one, the neutral states, Belgium, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden, drifted toward the Anglo-French camp. Their calculations were pragmatic. Britain's naval supremacy and France's continental position made it unwise to oppose them. Germany's behavior, increasingly strident, reinforced the impression that Berlin was the disruptive force, while Britain and France were defending equilibrium. Isolation thus became not merely numerical but moral. Germany was cast as the aggressor, even though its stated principles were grounded in treaty precedent. Wilhelm II followed the proceedings with mounting frustration. Reports from Algeciras confirmed what he most feared. The Entente Cordiale was not a fragile arrangement of convenience, but a functional alignment capable of resisting pressure. Worse still, his personal role in provoking the crisis through the Tangier visit made retreat humiliating. To concede would be to admit that his flamboyant gesture had backfired. Von Bülow, more cautious, recognized that compromise was unavoidable, but struggled to convince the Kaiser that partial concessions could still salvage prestige. At home, the German press reflected this dilemma. Nationalist newspapers railed against the coalition of envy seeking to encircle the Reich. The Pan-German League demanded firmness, warning that concessions would embolden rivals. Yet more moderate voices, including segments of the business community, worried about the costs of isolation. Germany's exports to France and Britain were substantial. Alienating these markets threatened economic interests. Industrialists urged the government to find a settlement that preserved dignity without prolonging confrontation. Inside the conference chamber, the isolation manifested in procedural defeats. When Germany proposed that police training be entrusted to neutral powers, such as Switzerland or Belgium, the suggestion found little support. Instead, the compromise drafted by Britain and France gained momentum. Moroccan policing would be supervised by French and Spanish officers, while international commissions would oversee customs and finance. This arrangement allowed Germany to claim that sovereignty had been preserved through international involvement, but in practice it entrenched French predominance. Each vote, each amendment, underscored Berlin's inability to rally more than Austria-Hungary to its side. The psychological impact was profound. For years, German diplomacy had projected confidence, buoyed by economic growth and military strength. At Algeciras, however, Berlin discovered that power did not automatically translate into influence. The Entente, reinforced by Edward VI's shadow diplomacy, had demonstrated resilience. Even Italy, nominally an ally, had drifted away. Germany's isolation was laid bare, not only to its rivals, but to its own statesmen. The humiliation was compounded by the American stance. Roosevelt's decision to support compromise tilted the balance decisively. German hopes of presenting the dispute as a clash between old European empires and modern principles collapsed. Instead, it was Germany that appeared antiquated, clinging to abstractions while others sought pragmatic solutions. The presence of the United States at Algeciras thus carried disproportionate weight. It confirmed that Berlin's isolation was transatlantic as well as continental. By March 1906, the inevitability of German retreat was clear. Von Bülow instructed his delegation to accept the compromise, calculating that prolonging the confrontation risked war, for which Germany was not yet prepared. Yet the damage to prestige was already done. Wilhelm's gamble had failed. The Entente Cordiale emerged stronger. Germany appeared diplomatically cornered, and the perception of encirclement, once a fear, was becoming a reality. For Paris and London, Germany's isolation was vindication. French newspapers celebrated the unity of the Entente and the support of neutral powers. British commentators emphasized the wisdom of Edward VI's diplomacy, which had transformed Britain from aloof observer to central arbiter of continental equilibrium. For Germany, the lesson was darker. The Moroccan crisis demonstrated that when it confronted its rivals, it could not count on allies beyond Austria-Hungary. The Reich, powerful on land and increasingly strong at sea, was diplomatically weak. This realization would haunt Berlin. Rather than moderating its policies, the experience at Algeciras deepened the sense of grievance. Wilhelm and his advisors concluded that Germany must act with greater decisiveness in future crises, lest its rivals interpret moderation as weakness. Thus, paradoxically, the isolation of 1906 planted the seeds of even more reckless confrontations to come. By April 1906, the Algeciras Conference drew to its conclusion. After nearly 3 months of debate, amendment, and maneuver, the shape of the final settlement emerged, codified in the Act of Algeciras. On the surface, it was presented as a carefully balanced compromise, an affirmation of Moroccan sovereignty, a recognition of international rights, and a framework for reform. But beneath the diplomatic language lay a clear verdict. France had preserved its essential objectives, Britain had demonstrated its commitment to the Entente, and Germany, despite forcing the crisis, had been compelled to accept a solution that exposed rather than enhanced its power. The act itself reaffirmed the Sultan's independence and the principle of equal economic opportunity for all nations. These provisions were designed to satisfy German rhetoric. Berlin could claim that its insistence on sovereignty had been recognized, and that no single power had been awarded a monopoly over Moroccan trade. Yet the heart of the settlement lay in the question of policing. Here, the compromise was decisive. Responsibility for training and organizing Morocco's police was entrusted jointly to France and Spain. French officers would assume the leading role, supported by Spanish contingents, while international commissions would provide nominal oversight. To mask the asymmetry, Switzerland was invited to supply a handful of officers, but their presence was symbolic, a fig leaf for impartiality. In practice, this arrangement entrenched France's predominance. With Algeria on its eastern frontier and Tunisia already under protectorate, France now extended its influence westward through control of Moroccan security. Spain's participation provided balance and reassurance, but its role was secondary. The international commissions, tasked with supervising customs, finance, and judicial reform, included representatives of all powers, yet their remit was narrow and bureaucratic. They could oversee accounts and procedures, but they lacked the means to challenge French authority on the ground. For Paris, this outcome was a vindication. Only months earlier, Delcass's resignation had suggested that German pressure might unravel French diplomacy. Now, despite setbacks, France had emerged with its essential objectives intact. The press celebrated the result as a triumph of firmness and alliance solidarity. Though France had been forced to negotiate under duress, the final act confirmed its primacy in Morocco and restored confidence in the Entente Cordiale. Rouvier's government, which had feared humiliation, instead reaped political benefit from an outcome that strengthened national prestige. Britain's satisfaction was no less evident. London had entered the crisis determined above all to test the credibility of its new partnership with France. At Algeciras, that credibility had been demonstrated. British support, expressed both in the conference chamber and through Edward VII's broader diplomacy, ensured that France did not stand alone. The Royal Navy's quiet readiness, coupled with the firmness of Britain's delegates, reminded all parties that London's commitment carried real weight. For the Foreign Office, the result confirmed the wisdom of abandoning isolation. Britain was no longer a detached arbiter, but an engaged participant in continental equilibrium. The Entente Cordiale, tested in crisis, had passed its first great trial. Germany, by contrast, found little solace. Its delegates signed the act, but they did so with evident reluctance. The concessions won, international commissions, reaffirmation of sovereignty, were cosmetic compared with the original objective of curbing French predominance. Worse, the attempt to split Britain from France had failed decisively. The Entente had not only survived but had been strengthened by the ordeal. Italy's evasiveness and America's tilt toward compromise further highlighted Germany's isolation. Berlin had forced the issue onto the international stage, only to discover that when the spotlight fell, it stood nearly alone. In Berlin, reactions ranged from frustration to bitterness. The Kaiser raged privately that his efforts to defend Moroccan independence had been thwarted by Edward VII's encirclement. Von Bülow sought to frame the outcome as a partial success, emphasizing that Germany had preserved the principle of international oversight and had forced France to submit to arbitration. but the public recognized the hollowness of such claims. Nationalist newspapers lamented that Germany had been humiliated. Moderates worried that the Reich's diplomacy had revealed recklessness without results. The phrase diplomatic defeat appeared with unsettling frequency in the commentary of the time. For the smaller states, the Act of Algeciras offered reassurance. Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian kingdoms welcomed the reaffirmation of sovereignty and equal trade, which they interpreted as protection for their own interests. Portugal and Spain, satisfied with recognition of their roles, supported the compromise. The United States, pleased to have played a mediating role, hailed the conference as proof that international disputes could be resolved peacefully through negotiation. Roosevelt himself claimed it as a victory for arbitration, though he understood privately that the settlement owed more to alliance cohesion than to principle. Yet beneath the apparent success of diplomacy, the conference left a residue of mistrust. Germany emerged convinced that it had been the victim of a coalition designed to curtail its ambitions. France, though gratified by the outcome, recognized that its security depended ever more heavily on Britain's partnership. Britain, for its part, concluded that Germany's policies were inherently destabilizing and that continued vigilance was essential. The act may have prevented war in 1906, but it also deepened the divisions that made future crises more dangerous. Morocco itself remained what it had been at the start, a fragile state, divided internally and dependent on foreign intervention. Sultan Abdelaziz, though nominally confirmed in his sovereignty, was left with even less real authority. French and Spanish officers supervised his police, international commissions scrutinized his finances, and foreign merchants dominated his economy. The illusion of independence was preserved, but the reality was one of growing subordination. For the Moroccan people, the Algeciras settlement marked not liberation, but the steady erosion of sovereignty. In Europe, however, the symbolic significance of the outcome overshadowed local realities. The Moroccan question had become the stage upon which the larger drama of alliance politics was played. At Algeciras, France and Britain demonstrated solidarity, Germany exposed its isolation, and the balance of power shifted accordingly. The crisis had begun with a theatrical gesture in Tangier. It ended with a treaty that confirmed the resilience of alliances and the fragility of German prestige. The lessons of Algeciras would echo far beyond Morocco. For France and Britain, it was proof that partnership could withstand intimidation. For Germany, it was a warning that diplomatic brinkmanship could end in humiliation. For all Europe, it was a reminder that beneath the veneer of compromise, the continent was dividing into armed camps, each crisis narrowing the possibility of reconciliation. The settlement reached at Algeciras in April 1906 was hailed publicly as a triumph of diplomacy. Newspapers across Europe applauded the avoidance of war, while statesmen congratulated themselves for steering the continent back from the brink. Yet beneath the surface of relief lay deeper consequences. The Moroccan crisis, far from being a passing colonial quarrel, had redrawn the diplomatic map of Europe. It crystallized alignments, hardened suspicions, and accelerated the division of the continent into rival blocs that would dominate the years leading up to 1914. The most immediate consequence was the consolidation of the Entente Cordiale. When it had been signed in 1904, the agreement between Britain and France had been viewed by many as a limited colonial settlement, a way of managing disputes in Egypt, Morocco, and West Africa. At Algeciras, however, the Entente was tested in the crucible of great power confrontation. British delegates did not merely support French positions as a matter of convenience. They defended them as if Britain's own prestige were at stake. This demonstration of solidarity transformed the Entente into something larger, a foundation for strategic cooperation. From that point onward, French leaders could count on British support in continental crises, while British policymakers recognized that their influence in Europe was tied to France's survival as a great power. For Germany, the consequences were far more negative. The conference exposed Berlin's isolation with painful clarity. The expectation that Britain would hesitate to back France had proved false. Italy, though formally bound by the Triple Alliance, had revealed itself unwilling to confront Paris. Even the United States had sided with compromise rather than principle. The Kaiser and his advisors concluded that Germany was the target of deliberate encirclement, orchestrated above all by Edward VII. Though this interpretation exaggerated the coherence of the Entente, it became a fixed article of belief in Berlin. From that belief flowed a new determination. If Germany was to avoid humiliation in future crises, it would have to act with greater firmness, perhaps even with force. The psychological scars of Algeciras ran deep. Wilhelm II, humiliated by the failure of his Tangier gamble, grew increasingly suspicious of Britain's intentions. He complained to his ministers that Germany was being denied its rightful place in the world, and that diplomatic methods had proved inadequate. Von Bülow, though more cautious, conceded that Germany must reconsider its tactics. The Reich's foreign policy began to shift from reliance on conferences and legal arguments toward reliance on military preparedness and demonstrations of strength. The seeds of a more confrontational posture were sown. For France, the outcome was reassuring but sobering. The Entente had held, but the crisis had revealed how vulnerable France remained militarily. Without Russia's effective support, crippled by defeat in Asia and revolution at home, France had been dependent almost entirely on Britain's goodwill. This dependency heightened French awareness of the need to cultivate London further and to pursue rearmament at home. The army's deficiencies, exposed in 1905, became a subject of intense debate in the Chamber of Deputies. The crisis thus reinforced the sense that France's survival in a future confrontation would depend on both alliances and preparation. Britain, too, drew lessons from the confrontation. The Royal Navy's global supremacy had been a reassuring backdrop, but the cabinet recognized that Germany's naval program continued to expand and that future crises might test Britain more directly. Support for France had been justified in part by the need to prevent German hegemony in Europe. But such support implied obligations that would draw Britain deeper into continental politics than at any time since the Napoleonic Wars. The shift from splendid isolation was no longer a matter of speculation. It was reality. The Anglo-French military conversations that began tentatively after Algeciras were a natural outgrowth of this new commitment. The wider European system was affected as well. Italy's evasiveness during the crisis exposed the fragility of the Triple Alliance. Rome's leaders calculated that their Mediterranean ambitions required accommodation with France, not confrontation. This ambiguity left Germany increasingly dependent on Austria-Hungary, whose support was loyal but limited. Vienna's backing carried no weight in North Africa and little prestige in Europe. The alliance system, once Germany's strength, was revealed as brittle. By contrast, the informal alignment of Britain and France had demonstrated unexpected resilience. The Moroccan crisis also altered perceptions among the smaller states. Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian kingdoms concluded that Britain and France were prepared to act together to preserve the balance of power, while Germany's methods were destabilizing. These impressions mattered, for they shaped neutrality policies and the calculus of security in regions that would later prove strategically vital. Even the Ottoman Empire, watching from afar, noted that Berlin had failed to rally allies in a colonial dispute, raising questions about Germany's ability to lead in other theaters. Perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. The crisis convinced many Europeans that the continent was moving inexorably toward division. The rhetoric of encirclement in Berlin, the language of vigilance in Paris, and the warnings of confrontation in London all reflected the same perception. Diplomacy had become a test of strength, and strength increasingly meant military preparedness. Algeciras had preserved peace, but it had not restored trust. Instead, it had deepened the conviction that future disputes would be settled not by compromise but by force. For Morocco, the act signed at Algeciras was another step in the erosion of independence. The Sultan's sovereignty was reaffirmed in theory, but foreign control over policing and finance left him with little authority. Moroccan opinion grew more disillusioned with the Sultan's ability to defend the realm, fueling unrest that would, in later years, provide the pretext for France to impose a formal protectorate. Thus, the very compromise designed to preserve independence laid the groundwork for its eventual dissolution. Looking back, contemporaries recognized that the Moroccan crisis had been a watershed. It was the first great diplomatic confrontation of the new century, and it revealed the contours of the system that would collapse in 1914. The Entente Cordiale had been strengthened, Germany had been embittered, and Europe had been polarized. The applause that greeted the act of Algeciras masked an unsettling truth. Far from easing rivalries, the conference had entrenched them. The balance of power had survived the test, but in surviving, it had become more rigid, more brittle, and more dangerous. The Moroccan crisis of 1905, 06 left no battlefield strewn with corpses, no cities reduced to rubble, and no armies locked in combat. Yet in its own way, it was one of the most decisive confrontations of the early 20th century. What it lacked in bloodshed, it made up for in strategic consequence. The Tangier Declaration, the resignation of Delcasse, the anxious months of diplomacy, and the tense debates at Algeciras together formed a drama that set the trajectory of European politics for the years to come. Its legacy was not the preservation of peace, but the sharpening of the antagonisms that would eventually make war unavoidable. For Edward VII, the crisis confirmed his reputation as Europe's peacemaker. Though contemporaries understood that his diplomacy had been aimed less at conciliation than at building a bulwark against German assertiveness. The Entente Cordiale, which many in 1904 had regarded as little more than a colonial bargain, emerged from the Moroccan crisis as a tested partnership. French statesmen could point to Britain's visible support as proof that they would not be left isolated again. British leaders, meanwhile, recognized that their influence on the continent was no longer theoretical but real, exercised in defense of an ally. The Anglo-French relationship, hardened by shared experience, became the cornerstone of the European system. For Germany, the legacy was humiliation and resentment. Wilhelm II, who had expected that a bold gesture in Tangier would restore German prestige, found instead that it had exposed the fragility of his diplomacy. The Kaiser's personal involvement in the affair, his grand pronouncements and insistence on confrontation, made the failure deeply personal. He interpreted the outcome not as a miscalculation, but as proof of a conspiracy orchestrated by Edward VII. The narrative of encirclement took hold in Berlin. Germany saw itself not as a reckless power isolated by its own actions, but as a besieged nation targeted by hostile alliances. This perception, though distorted, shaped policy for years to come. The Moroccan crisis also had institutional consequences. The German Foreign Office, embarrassed by the outcome, faced criticism from nationalists who demanded a more forceful approach. Von Bülow, though he managed to hold on to office, saw his credibility erode. The Reichstag, inflamed by nationalist rhetoric, increasingly pressed for military preparedness. Naval expansion, already underway, gained further momentum as Tirpitz argued that only through sea power could Germany break out of its isolation. Thus, the failure at Algeciras fed directly into the arms race that would dominate the next decade. In France, the lesson was equally clear. The humiliation of Delcasse's resignation had been redeemed by the solidarity of the Entente, but the underlying weakness of France's military position remained evident. The army had been unready in 1905. The ally on whom France depended, Russia, had been incapacitated by war and revolution. Henceforth, French policy would focus relentlessly on strengthening ties with Britain and preparing for a future confrontation with Germany. The debates of the Chamber of Deputies in the years after Algeciras reflected this determination. Budgets for rearmament were justified explicitly by the memory of German pressure in 1905. Britain, too, emerged transformed. The Moroccan crisis marked the end of its long-standing reluctance to entangle itself in continental politics. The Royal Navy had loomed in the background of the Algeciras proceedings, a silent but decisive factor, and the Foreign Office had discovered the value of alliance in sustaining Britain's influence. After 1906, military conversations between Britain and France began to take shape. Though informal at first, these discussions laid the groundwork for the coordination that would prove critical in 1914. The crisis had convinced London that aloofness was no longer an option. Germany's assertiveness required active partnership. For the smaller states, the crisis underscored their vulnerability. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia saw that their fates would be decided by the alignments of larger powers. Italy learned that its place in the Triple Alliance was uncertain, as its interests in the Mediterranean increasingly diverged from those of Germany. Spain, though pleased to share responsibility for Moroccan policing, recognized that its role was subordinate. The Ottoman Empire, observing from afar, noted that Germany's inability to rally allies in Morocco cast doubt on its capacity to act as a reliable patron in the eastern Mediterranean. Morocco itself was left weakened, its independence preserved in name but eroded in substance. The Sultan's authority had been further undermined by the intrusion of foreign officers into his police and the scrutiny of international commissions over his finances. The population, already skeptical of Abdelaziz's leadership, grew restless. In the years that followed, unrest and rebellion would destabilize the Sultanate, providing the pretext for France to impose a formal protectorate in 1912. In this sense, the Algeciras Act, hailed as a settlement, was only an interlude in the gradual partition of Morocco. The broader legacy of 1905-06 was psychological. The crisis had revealed the brittleness of Europe's diplomatic fabric. Though war had been avoided, it was avoided not through reconciliation, but through the assertion of alliances. Trust between powers eroded further. Germany no longer believed it could secure recognition through conferences. France no longer believed it could resist without Britain, and Britain no longer believed it could remain detached. The logic of bloc politics had taken hold. Every subsequent crisis, the Bosnian annexation of 1908, the Agadir confrontation of 1911, the Balkan Wars, would be interpreted through the prism of the alignments hardened at Algeciras. Historians would later look back on the Moroccan crisis as the first act of the tragedy that culminated in 1914. It demonstrated the danger of diplomatic brinkmanship in an era of fragile balances. It showed how prestige could outweigh practical interests, how public opinion and national pride constrained statesmen, and how colonial disputes could reverberate into continental confrontations. Above all, it revealed that Europe's peace, though preserved, was increasingly precarious. The crisis of 1905-06 was thus remembered not for the independence it affirmed, but for the divisions it deepened. To Edward VII's admirers, it marked his triumph as a statesman. To Wilhelm II's critics, it exposed the recklessness of his diplomacy. To the peoples of Europe, it was a warning of what lay ahead. In the years to come, Morocco would again become the stage for rivalry, and Europe would again edge toward catastrophe. The legacy of 1905 was not a lasting settlement, but the sharpening of a rivalry that would, within a decade, ignite a world war.